Welcome to Rising Strong Conversations on Growth After Trauma. I'm your host today, Jennifer Bowen. Hello. And I want to thank you for being here, whether you're someone who's experienced trauma yourself or just curious about how people transform hardship into strength, meaning, and resilience. The purpose of this podcast is simple: to shift how we think about trauma. So often, when trauma is discussed, the conversation ends with symptoms, for example, anxiety, depression, grief, avoidance, numbness. But psychology has shown us another side of the story, a side that includes strength, change, identity, and possibility. And this is where the idea of post traumatic growth, or PTG, comes in. In plain terms, PTG is the positive psychological change that can occur after struggling with a traumatic experience. It doesn't mean trauma is good or easy. It means that the struggle to make sense of the trauma can lead to new strengths, new perspectives, and new meanings. Some examples of PTG could look like a person who survives a serious illness and develops a deeper appreciation for life, someone who loses a loved one and later becomes closer to family or more compassionate towards other people. And then one last example that I'll give is a person who grows up in an instability and later gains emotional insight, independence, and purpose. I believe PTG doesn't replace pain, it grows alongside of it. Today's episode is going to be focusing on one of the most influential PTG frameworks, Joseph's effective cognitive processing model. This model explains that growth doesn't just appear after trauma, it actually develops through a process. It starts with a traumatic event, something that shatters our assumptions about how the world works. After the event, our mind enters a processing cycle where we experience emotional reactions like fear, anger, guilt, sadness, or even numbness. At the same time, we begin thinking about trauma, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. That thinking process shows up as rumination, and Joseph explains that there are two types. The first type is going to be a brooding rumination, which is looping thoughts like, why did this happen to me? This basically keeps us stuck. The second one is going to be reflective pondering. That's the deeper questioning, like, what does this mean for my future? Who am I now? And this is what opens up the door for meaning and growth. As time moves on, we move through the coping strategies, sometimes avoidance, sometimes seeking support, sometimes shutting down, completely stonewalling, and then even in some cases can be reaching out. Eventually, we are able to reflect rather than stay stuck in our brooding. Something important happens. We begin to rebuild our worldview. So Joseph calls this the shift from assimilation, which means trying to return to life as it was before the trauma, to accommodation, which means integrating the trauma into a new understanding of yourself and the world. And then this is just my infographic of all of the steps, basically, with some images on it. To make this feel real, I actually wanted to connect my own life. Personally, growing up, my mom struggles with bipolar disorder and drug addiction. That meant for my home environment when I was younger, it wasn't always stable or predictable. There were emotional highs and lows, moments of separation, uncertainty, and times where I felt responsible for the things that I don't think any child should feel responsible for. And at the time, I didn't really have words for it, but I just knew life felt chaotic. Looking back through the lens of the Joseph's model, I can see that the trauma point clearly, my worldview, what psychologists would call my assumptive world, um, was shaped by unpredictability, fear, and survival thinking. Emotionally, I went through many stages of Joseph, um, confusion, anger, sadness, and later silence and avoidance. Those were the early coping strategies. But as I got older, something shifted. I moved from brooding uh, those eternal loops of why she wasn't who I needed. Why was this my experience? Into reflective meaning making. My questions became like, what did this teach me about empathy? How did this shape my independence? And how does my past influence the kind of person and future I want to build? Support from others did play a huge role in that shift, like friends, mentors, and stable relationships throughout my life that helped me process instead of completely avoid the situation. And according to the Joseph model, that shift from emotional survival to reflection and meaning making is what allows the PTG to emerge. And then this is my slide 4, growth, self-efficacy, and resilience. So what would growth look like? Research shows that two major factors connected to PTG is self-efficacy and resilience. Self-efficacy is a concept introduced by psychologists, and it's basically just like the belief I can handle this, I can cope, I can survive and move forward. And it's not a confidence in everything, but it's confidence in your ability to navigate through the difficulty. Resilience, I believe, is closely connected. It's the capacity to adapt and recover and also rebuild despise adversity. The studies of Joseph show that when someone believes they have the ability to cope, they are more likely to engage in reflection rather than avoidance. That reflective process strengthens resilience, which then strengthens your identity. For me, growth showed up gradually in emotional awareness, independence, boundaries, compassion, and the ability to make meaning instead of staying stuck in pain. So PTG is not forgetting about the trauma. God, no. It's about transforming the relationship that you have with it. So, as we wrap up today's conversation, I do want to leave you with this. Joseph's model reminds us that trauma may disrupt our world, but meaning making can rebuild it. The process takes time, support, and reflection, but growth is very possible. If you're somewhere in the middle of the process, unsure, hurting, or still navigating the cycle, that's okay. Healing is never linear. Your story isn't over and growth is still possible. And thank you for listening to my first podcast show, Rising Strong. And I guess we'll see you guys next time.